thanks for joining us. I'm excited that you both bring a perspective of a marketing leader as well as now a coach who's helping help executives, including marketing leaders. So let's start with the role of the CMO and how the role of the CMO really is changing. There's more pressure now to prove outcomes while serving as a dot connector across the business. So with that as a jumping off point, let's talk a bit about growth, and specifically, growth is always the North Star of marketing efforts, especially as many brands and industries are dealing with a COVID decline. What have you been hearing from CMOs regarding how the pandemic has shifted their needs or how they've had to pivot with the added pressures to prove marketing impact?
Yeah, it's an important question. And most of the answer is COVID and the dynamics and a changing business environment simply put more weight on what was already true. It puts more dynamism into what was already true, which is what I call the general manager or GM mindset. That yes, marketers are our first job. We are about growth. We are also about the consumer, and we have to always hold those hats, and ideally in reverse order, the consumer or the end customer in a B2B world. And what does it mean to hold the consumer and hold the growth and wear the general manager mindset? That's especially true now, but it's not new. It's not different. What does it mean to be thinking about the top line and the bottom line? What does it mean to be thinking about the future and the now? And that's what marketers have to be able to do and hold at the same time. In our conversation earlier, Jeff, you were talking about how marketers need to have both focused on art and science. I'll add to that. Marketers have to have heart, art, and science. That's the intersection of, because the heart is also what's intentional about the customer. It's also what's intentional about what does it mean to hold influence and engage internally so you can get done the agenda that you have or that somebody else has and you buy into, and what is the dynamic between those two. So it really is, number one, general manager mindset. And then what does it mean to hold business leadership first, not marketing leadership first, which is related? What does it mean to have your first team is your peer team, your colleagues, not your functional team, which is of course critical. That's what got you to the CMO job. But you now have to manage across an enterprise, whether it's a 500 person or a 500,000 person enterprise. It's how are you managing across, and how are you bringing that business leadership around growth, which is the traditional marketing and communications. It's also around the customer experience and the revenue. What are all, and the product itself, what are all the dimensions, whether you own it as the CMO or not? Those are all the parts that drive growth, and how are you contributing and thinking about it that way?
So specifically, you talked a bit about looking across the business and a cross-functional team. Oftentimes, you've got individuals who don't have a deep understanding of marketing or how it works, or they might feel subjectively that they do, right? It goes both ways. So are there specific tools, tips, resources that have been your go-to, and how you've counseled others to say, okay, here is where I, Alan, have been successful, or where I've seen others successful in advocating for and then proving the value of marketing across an organization?
Yeah, well, so there's a lot to unpack there, right? So part of that is so many people see themselves as a marketer. Oh, I've got an idea. Why haven't you done this, or whatever, or I like blue better in the extreme, right? And for marketers, what I counsel and what I did when I was one myself is be clear about decision rights and be clear about influence rights. And those are different. And being clear about what is yours to own and drive, and where do you still want to let and hear people out? And how do you get alignment around, let me make sure, so let's say, Jeff, you're in IT and you're giving me some marketing ideas. I can handle it a number of ways. I can say, get out of my sandbox, Jeff. I could ignore you. I could welcome your input. I could act on your input. Well, those are really different answers. And what I counsel is make it clear that input is welcome. And if there's too much of it, find efficient ways of gathering that input. But make it clear, happy to hear ideas, great ideas come from everywhere. And I'm going to be deciding with my team what we need to do here. But bring on the ideas, because there's lots of times we execute ideas that we didn't come up with. The IT guy might have that perfect idea or the twist on the idea. So it's really about clarity of decision rights and then clarity of influence rights. And influence rights includes, if you just slam the door on Jeff, the IT guy, well, that's not going to be so helpful for navigating other complex issues that may come up or will come up. Does that help address the question, or was there something more you'd like to?
No, that makes sense. As you take a look at alignment across your organization, I think you tackle my second question, which is good, right? In terms of getting buy-in across a business, knowing that there's many different individuals who might feel like they've got some type of say, or you have to work in combination or conjunction with those teams because you're not necessarily working in a silo or a vacuum.
Yeah, well, just to build on that, make sure you're playing the long game. So, the classic "don't win the battle, lose the war" thing. I'd much rather give or have things take longer, be slower, even if I'm going to take a couple of hits from my boss. If that's going to help me build a relationship, doesn't mean consensus. Really different animal. Sometimes there's consensus, but it's about the relationship that's going to let me be effective, let my clients be effective. So when I'm working with a client, and there was a COO I was working with recently, and she was this like hard charging, get things done, and incredibly effective. She also had marketing in her world, and she wound up having this one very challenging conversation with the CFO, and she said, "I just told it like it was." And I said, "How'd that go for you?" She said, "Not so well." I was like, she said, "Well, it was more efficient and effective." I said, "Was it actually more efficient and effective?" She said, "No, actually it blew up my whole next day." And that's a micro example of what does it mean then we modeled what might that conversation have been like, even if the guy was being challenging and difficult, and there are difficult personalities we all work with. People are usually coming from a place of fear and worry. And if you can hold that and recognize that and see where are they coming from, how can I support that and how can they support me? And now, what's the outcome I want to get to? And how do I get there best with a long-term view? And then you act differently, you manage differently. I'll give an example from my marketing days. When I was running digital marketing at Wells Fargo, I needed to integrate. I believed the right thing. We had 7 digital agencies across the enterprise because each major division had their own. Like, this was crazy, right? Made no sense whatsoever. But not such a small task to say, let's fire them all and pick one. And by the way, I'll manage them for y'all. Not how I approached it, but was the outcome. It was exactly the outcome that we worked together to build consensus around. Is this working? What's broken? What's working? How is it serving us? How is it hurting us? And then working with the heads of each of those divisions to say, is this what you want? The independence is great, but here's what's breaking. We're competing with each other in the marketplace, for example. And so we started to build a consensus at the top and we helped to relax the reins of fear of people losing their control. I made it clear I was simply a facilitator. Yes, I was running digital marketing at the enterprise level, but simply as facilitator. Now, this was a heavy lift over a couple of years, but at the end of that, we fired all the agencies, by the way, including the one I had hired, and went through a new pitch and hired somebody that was different from all of those. As it turned out, there were some contenders in there. So that was just about recognizing the long haul and what does it mean, and how do you tackle challenging issues, but recognizing back to the heart. Besides the art and science, where's the heart in making it work?
Yeah, I mean, that's helpful. And you touched on some of this related to the long game. I want to kind of dive maybe a bit deeper into the balance between long-term and short-term needs.
Sure.
There's often this push and pull between needing to deliver or see it now growth versus longer term organization initiatives. So what advice do you have as you look towards striking the balance between the short term, top line same store sales, trips, frequency, promotions versus the long-term balance across marketing goals? So if you could talk a bit about that, what you've seen in the past and what you're seeing now, especially with there being so much more pressure to drive growth in the short term.
Yeah, and clearly marketers have to do both, or any CXO, right? Whether it's chief revenue officer, chief marketing officer, chief growth officer, etc. And we have to do both. And short term can be such a trap. It's a necessity, but it's also a trap. Be clear first on the urgent and the important. And I know everybody's heard that model. I'm not sure most people that I work with don't actually use that model or operate on it consciously. And being clear on what are the top 3 programs, initiatives for long-term growth, and how am I managing each of those, and always having them front and center, because the urgent I will never lose. You can't lose the short term. It's going to be there. It's going to be in your face every day, the fire drills, the number that came in 2% below forecast and you were hoping to beat forecast, or let alone if it's much more significant than that, or you grew 10%. I remember a conversation with my CEO at one point where we'd grown 10%. That's pretty awesome, right? Nope. Pressure was on. We were supposed to be growing 20%. What happened, Alan? Right? So that's the short term. And getting true alignment with the CEO, with your boss, with the CFO too, and whoever your boss is, but ideally, and their boss, if you're not reporting to the CEO, and know what does success look like on the vision, on the strategy, on the short term and the long term deliverables, and what's a just can't miss. What's the eye on the ball, cannot miss this thing. And maybe it's the quarterly number, maybe it's a product launch, maybe it's the traffic numbers in store, whatever the right pieces are. Be really clear on what the alignment on us is on the most important metrics, and then make sure not to lose the long term in there.
Where have you seen most executives that you're working with struggle with related to what you just shared?
Well, clearly keeping the eye on the long term, because we all get sucked into the immediate. But and actually I would say even more than that, the biggest challenge is not recognizing the influencing needed. The higher you go, the more your job has surprisingly less control. I suspect you've discovered this, Jeff, as a CMO, and you actually are now having to work across, as I started in this conversation, so much more, and influence peers, and even influence very senior team members on your own team, who they have to be given room to run. So we actually in some ways get less power as we climb and far more influence. And the far more influence is where we can have tremendous impact. And that's where I work with nearly every client I work with, which is how are they building and using that influence for the good of the company first, and yes, of course, for people in their careers as well. It works both ways. But if the company hat isn't on first, then it's gonna go sideways. If the company hat is on first and it's not fully aligned to what your own goals are, you work that one out. You figure that out. Sometimes that means you move on, but usually you figure it out. There was another role I was in, this goes back a ways. I was the first person to run e-business for Blue Shield of California a long time ago. And I was person number 1 and then wound up managing a team of about 50. I'm sure it's far more than that now. But one of the things I did towards the end was I said, to grow this the way we need to integrate this back into the enterprise, and we need to transform technology. And I can't do that. I took it to a place that I could accomplish, but I wasn't the guy to transform the technology architecture. So we need somebody to do that. So having the courage is the next point I want to make, to know where you think the company needs to go. And then, yes, be clear what you want your role to be in that. And usually there's lots of room for people who are willing to think that way and find what success looks like. But in that case, actually in that one, I wound up leaving the company with the CEO's help, and he's the one who helped me get into Wells Fargo, in fact, as a side note. Because because my stock was high, but I just managed myself out of my job too, in that case.
So speaking of
Which was,
that, it,
sorry?
it feels like these days CMOs are taking on more responsibility, or the role is shifting to a chief growth officer or a CMO and a CXO. So
Yeah.
how do you balance the belief that, well, potentially the title or the role might be limiting, or there's a need for the CMO to do more? What types of, how have you counseled others as they've either been asked to expand or they're looking to expand their role?
Yeah. It's number one, always be clear on what the role should be. Doesn't mean it's defined that way in your company. And for me, it is always everything growth. Doesn't mean I own it, but I feel accountability as a CMO. I counsel my CMO or related role clients to have the broader aperture, that if it's a growth driver for your company, you need your eye on it. And whether that's, again, about the customer experience, the product, the marketing and communications, the public relations. You may have peers who run some of those functions. Make sure you're tight with them. Figure out what that looks like, because everything about growth is part of your role, whether it's part of your job or not. And then really get clarity on the metrics that matter. We can get so deep into our worlds as marketers, like everybody else, of all the metrics and sub-metrics, leading and lagging. And hopefully we're focused that way, by the way, because if we're not going to succeed as marketers. So we need to be metrics driven. But then make sure you're boiling up to what are the most important metrics that matter against the top objectives of the company, not of the marketing function. And then be clear on what they are and talk about those. So when you're in the C-suite talking about marketing, you're not talking about the fine-tuned points of the metrics in the dashboard. God help it if you're putting together, showing a dashboard with an Excel spreadsheet with 50 lines. It's what are the 3 to 5 that really count and have alignment. And those include anything that's around growth.
Right. Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think as you look at having conversations, especially these days, and it probably isn't so different than 10, 15 years ago, people have a limited ability to get into depth, right? And I think especially now where you've got this mobile phone in front of you and you're running from meeting to meeting and there's this onslaught of content and communications, it's like, how do you simplify and speak in headlines and implications?
Yeah, headlines, implications, but data driven, right? In all cases. Yeah, it's storytelling. It's what we're doing right here, right now, right? It's storytelling.
All right, so I want to talk a bit about new ideas and specifically coming to the table with new ideas. We've all dealt with detractors, naysayers, those that have said, hey, we've done this before, we've tried it, it's failed, this is never going to work. How do you, and you talked about some of this earlier about moving beyond consensus, right? Mm-hmm. How do you let others say their piece, mark their territory, but not let that get in front of you or be an obstacle for moving forward? What advice would you have?
Yeah, so it is around the clarity of decision rights. So, and this will sound tongue in cheek, but there's a CMO I deeply respect, and when the CFO comes to him with ideas for marketing, can we sit down and talk about the ideas and how you're executing X, Y, and Z? Let's say, absolutely. Let's split the meeting. We'll do 2 parts. We'll go deep into what we're planning in marketing. And I'd love to spend time talking about the accounting system choices you've made and why you're using them that way. And it makes the point, right? It's funny, real too. It's saying, I am happy to talk with you about it. I'm happy to share plans. I'm not happy to spend lots of time getting approvals or authority. I already have that. I do want your ideas. So I'm happy to take 15 minutes, 30 minutes, grab a cup of coffee. I'm also happy to create something I did at one point, and this was really effective. We created a Google Doc in this case. Not all companies will let that work, but find a sharing system that works, or a spreadsheet where anybody can add their ideas. And somebody's job is to at least look at all the ideas. We don't have to respond. We don't commit to responding. We commit to looking. We'll always look. And then, by the way, sometimes we'll say, hey, so-and-so had this really good idea to explore X. We took a look at it and we're actually moving forward with something. Or we took a look at it, thought it could be good, didn't work out. So good. That's about engaging. And again, why? To build influence, to build a relationship for the long haul. But it's also about, I know you had a question that tied to, sometimes they say that'll never work, and turns out they're right, didn't work. That's okay. If you never fail, we all talk about this, right? If you never fail, you're not trying hard enough. That means you're playing it way too safe. Got to take risks, but then own them, saying, yep, we're trying it, and I think it's going to work, but I'm not sure. And if I try 5 new things, I'm hoping 1 or 2 of them are going to work. I set that expectation too. If it's a big bet, I kind of hope it's going to work, but sometimes I don't. You know, I took a startup into sports sponsorships for the first time. I thought it's a light. We negotiated a terrific deal with some regional sports, and it was an experiment, but it was still an expensive experiment for who we were. It didn't work. I mean, it got us attention, but nothing happened on the sales side in the short term, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. But we built it in a way that we would have some leading indicators. Just didn't work. It's like, okay, my bad. That was a bad use of 50 grand. 50 grand is a lot of money for a little company. So, okay, we'll keep trying. So naming it, owning it, and moving on.
Is that how you handle in that situation or other situations those that want to point fingers or assign blame?
I assign it first. It's too late. Right? If it's like, hey, my bad. Hey, the first thing I'll report back. You know that thing I thought I convinced you all to try? It's a bad idea. We'll try some more ideas. Some of those will be bad too. Some of them are going to work. Let's keep going.
Yeah, I think oftentimes we've talked about some of this. I think we all want to highlight the wins and advocate for where we're doing well.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it's how do you balance what's not so working so well? What have you learned from it? How do you grow from it? And that's an area where I think me specifically is an area where I need to do a better job of, because I think so much like where these organizations are, you look at performance reviews and advocating for individuals for getting promoted. It's all about what have you done well? What have you done well?
Yeah. What's also interesting is think about, and this is a broader point, but you triggered it for me, Jeff, which is what does it mean to build coalitions and build that influence? It includes saying when you're wrong, being authentic. It also means, for example, turning down money sometimes. I remember at one point I was working with a division. We had done some successful pilots. We were scaling the business. He kept pouring more money in, and he said, hey, I want to double down here. I've got another $5 million. Let's invest. I said, I'm not ready for it. I can't take your money. I don't know that it'll be well spent right now. We have to figure some other things out first. And he was shocked. He just like, wait, you're not taking it? I said, no, I'm not willing to spend it. I'm just not, because I don't think we can get good returns for it until we figure this thing out. We did eventually. And then there was a point at which he said, can we spend even more? I said, no, we've now hit the part of the curve where it won't be efficient for you. Let's not do it. So it built the credibility that said, I will push for the things I believe in and challenge us to do more and take risks. But this isn't about I want more budget. I'm fighting for my budget. That's a horrible conversation for any marketer to be in.
Yeah. So one last question. I want to end it with some advice that you can offer up to other executives or chief marketing officers.
Yeah.
What would you say is something that you could share right now that would help other CMOs lead more effectively and have an immediate impact either now or next year?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a few things come to mind. So first, and this may sound like an odd one to start with, but it's trust that you are in your role for a reason. So many have the imposter syndrome where somebody's around them telling them they don't belong in the role, or mostly they're telling themselves that. You are the leader that's right for this role right now. So trust that and own that. You got to start there, because that's confidence is what allows you to show up. That confidence allows you to be courageous. which is another one of these of the other points I wanted to make here. What does it mean to take risks? We talked about that. Not taking risks is in fact the biggest risk. Be courageous, but also demonstrate vulnerability. It's okay to say, you know what, I'm nervous about this one, and we're going to do it anyway. And let's go. Demonstrate resilience for yourself and for your team. And the combination of resilience and vulnerability is powerful. That's about optimism, confidence, belief in control, calm, comfort with ambiguity. That's what resilience is. And hold that. I already talked about being a business leader first, not a marketing leader first. Obviously, you're going to be a marketing leader. And we talked about building influence. I talk about the circle of influence of who are the 5 people you most need to have in your corner for success for you in the business over the next year. What do you do? Where do you stand with those 5? How are you nursing those relationships? How are you building them explicitly all the time? And on the resilience piece, I'll end with a comment, a quote I just love. You know, Admiral James Stockdale was a former prisoner of war. And when he talks about clarity and belief in hard times and challenging times, I'll actually read it. I pulled this up because I wanted to share it. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they may be. That certainly holds in the land of COVID. That certainly hands when you're in a bigger role. It certainly lands when something didn't go your way. If you need to pivot your business, people aren't showing up in the retail stores. I have a client who's in the events business. Guess what? Not the best place to be right now. But I'm working with him, the CEO, and how he's pivoted his business this year because he believed in the power and importance of what they were doing, but he was clear as day about the challenges that they were facing in the short term.
Awesome, Alan. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time.
You're welcome.
And I appreciate 2 weeks in a row. So that's been a treat for me.
Me as well, Jeff.